We don't know what happens to people. So you might have a loved one or someone that has died, and you thought, boy, if anyone was destined to hell, that person was. But you don't know that during the dying process that they were given that same revelation that I was, that God became real to them, and they were able then to accept the Lord. And so I want you to be encouraged by that, because even yourself, if you have the doubts and all, I would ask you to keep searching. But I think that everyone has that opportunity during the dying process to do what's right. My name is Kat Dunkle, and I have a story that I feel very strongly that I was led to tell people. I had an experience several years ago that has changed my life dramatically. I grew up in a family that was very dysfunctional. My parents, I don't know how they ever got together, but my father, he had to quit school in the 6th grade to support his mother, his widowed mother. He joined the Navy in World War II and was uneducated, strong boxer kind of guy. My mother was a very educated woman, was the first woman in her graduating class of pharmacy school at Oregon State University. So they got together somehow, and I think there was always this competition between them that caused problems in their marriage. They found the one common thing that they did have was alcohol. My dad was a very angry man, and kind of took it out on us kids. My mother wanted the Leave It to Beaver kind of home where everything was perfect. The wife did all these things, and it was just bad. We weren't allowed to talk too loud. We would chew our food too loudly. We'd get in trouble. We couldn't have friends over. Our childhood was miserable. I kind of believed in God at that time, because most kids do. I mean, it's just kind of ingrained in us, and especially back in those days, they actually had prayer in school. So I did believe in God at that time. And as a little child, I loved going to church occasionally with my mom when she'd go. I found such peace there. It was just great. I loved everything about it. But as I started into my teen years, I got angry too, like my dad. And he would always take me by the shoulder and say, you're a strong person. And I never felt much like a feminine little girl, because I was born between two brothers. My older brother was just about a year older than me, and my younger brother. So the little girl things just didn't happen in my life. And I did grow up to be strong, but also with that, into my teen years, I became very rebellious and did things that I shouldn't have done. Alcohol was another part of my life at that time. And I wanted to believe in God at that time, but was having difficulty. So as I grew even into my early 20s, things just got really bad at that time. To get away from home, jumped into a marriage to an alcoholic, of course, because that's what was familiar to me. He was kind and gentle, but turned into be a real animal as far as abuse goes. And so physical and mental abuse was part of my family. And then by the time I was 21 years old, I had 2 small children and a nervous breakdown. I knew I had to get out of the marriage, but how do you with 2 little babies? And the boys were just about a little over 1 and 3 years old. And but one night I walked out into our living room, and my husband was passed out in the bedroom, snoring loudly, and the smell of alcohol. And I looked up into the sky and I said, God, if you're really up there, if you exist, if you just give me 1 year to know what it's like to know happiness, to feel like a normal person, I just want 1 year out of life, and then you can take my life, kill me, whatever. But just that 1 year. But I turned away, because at that point I knew God didn't exist. Too many things had happened in my life to prove that God didn't exist. I had a friend that was in a car accident and died. And I went to his funeral. It was the first person I'd ever seen that was dead. And it was just a wax doll laying there. I thought, well, what happened to him? His life is just gone forever. At that point, I just started searching everywhere I could, every church I went to, but nothing resonated with me. I read anything I could find my hands on about dying and death and what happens to you after death, and nothing. No churches, nothing happened. So I just figured this is it. Once you die, and you're gone forever. So I turned away from the window that night in Kansas City, knowing that God did not exist. The next day, I packed up my 2 boys in an old beat-up car, and we headed from Kansas City to Seattle. We landed in Seattle, and I got into government housing, which I felt so excited to be free. And we had no furniture. The boys and I moved into this unit. I had a little gas stove with a pilot light, and we would put our sleeping bags on the floor. We had no beds on the floor, and we'd pretend that it was a campfire and we were camping. And the boys loved it. I mean, they had a great time. They could run through the house and no fear of breaking anything. And we played games, and we went to the library and got books. And I was happy. I mean, I was on my own now, and there was no abuse. There was no angry father. There was no drunken husband. And I had my sons, and I was happy. I got a really good job, and I thought life was really going to be okay for me at that point. And at work, there was this lady that came to me one day and said that she had just the man I was going to marry. Well, I didn't like men at this point. I had my father as an example, and my ex-husband as an example. When I was a small child, I was sexually molested by a man and taken into court and put on a stand. They did that to little kids at this time. I was 6 years old, and the defense attorney was calling me a liar and saying that I made the whole thing up, and I couldn't figure out why was he so mad at me? Why is he so mad at me? And so my life was filled with problems with men, and I wanted no part of it. I had a good job now. I had my sons, and I was going to make my life happy all by myself. And anyway, this man named Don called me that night, and my reception to him was very cool. And he asked me out, and I thought, well, at least it's a free dinner. Boys and I, a lot of times, had Cheerios 3 times a day because I couldn't afford good food for us. And a lot of times, if I would go out, I would stuff as much as I could in my bag and take it home. And so I went out with him that night, and I don't know what happened, but looking at him was just like, I just was looking into the eyes of the most incredible human being I'd ever met in my life. He was handsome. He was kind. He was gentle. Just everything that you could possibly imagine. He was perfect, and nobody's perfect, but to me, at that time, he was. And so we went out that night, and the next night, and the next night, and the next night, and for 27 days that happened. And on the 28th day, we were going to meet for coffee. I said, I just need a break. I'm going to stay home tonight. And he said, well, just stop by just for a quick, half hour. So I did. And this friend of Don's, a man he worked with named Bill, came wandering in, so drunk he couldn't even stand up. And, he leaned over the table. He said, you know what? He said, you two are perfect for each other. You two need to get married. And he said, Don, he said, what would it take for you to get married? And Don looked at him and said, well, if we had $200, we'd go to Reno and get married tonight. And I absolutely thought I was going to faint on the spot. I knew that I had these feelings inside of me. I didn't really know even what love was, but I had these feelings inside of me for him that was just screaming. I was terrified because I'd never felt this in me before. I never felt love for anybody. And to think that he would even consider me was just beyond anything I could possibly think of. So when he said that, I just went in shock, and I said yes. And so we went that after knowing each other only 28 days, drove to Reno that night, and we got married. And the first year that I knew Don, we were married on February 28th. So, it was just incredible. His house was filled with things that he had collected when he was in the Navy, china and crystal that were in boxes, and he owned his own home. He owned a brand new car, and the boys had a daddy, and things have been more perfect for me. So I had this good job. I had this wonderful man in my life. And for the first year of our lives, there was never a harsh word spoken. Life every day was an exciting adventure for me. My boys were happy. Life couldn't have gotten any better. Well, my husband, Don, bought a tavern with a friend of his. We were in our 20s, early 20s, knew nothing about business, but the partner did, and talked Don into going into business with him. They bought this tavern, and I just was so opposed to it because my thoughts about alcohol had brought me nothing but pain in my life. And so I didn't like it, but I wouldn't stop him from having his dream. So that was difficult for us because there wasn't a lot of money coming in other than what I was making. The tavern took most of it, and unknown to us, the partner's wife was doing the bookkeeping, and he was doing most of the managing, and we were doing most of the money end of it. And anyway, that was failing somewhat. And Don and I, on our first anniversary, we went out to a wonderful dinner. It had been exactly 1 year, just like you remember back in Kansas City. I asked God for 1 year to show me happiness, and then you could devastate my life. Well, I didn't think about that, but on our anniversary, we went out to a wonderful dinner and stopped. He said, "Do you mind if we stop by the tavern, see how things are going?" And so we did. And there was a barmaid there that was flicking her hair, obviously flirting with Don, and everybody was gathering around him, congratulating him on the new business and all. And I was sitting back in a corner, getting more and more angry about our wonderful night being interrupted by this, and that barmaid flirting with him, and couldn't he see what she was doing? And I was just getting angrier and angrier. And pretty soon, I don't know, it was half hour or so, I just got up, left my coat and everything, went walking out of the tavern, just going home. I was just going to walk home and just leave him there. And it was pouring down rain, and some guy stopped and said, "Lady, do you want to ride?" And I said, "Yeah." And I hopped in the car with a total stranger, and he drove me around, and I was crying, and I was soaking wet. And finally said, "Do you want to go home?" And I said, "Yes." And he took me home. I figure he must have been some kind of angel. But anyway, I was walking up the driveway to go in, and Don had come home, and he was angry. And, "What do you think you're doing?" And so after that, our marriage started to really go downhill. We started picking at each other and arguing about different things. And so on April 6th, Don went to work. That was the only night I worked at the tavern, because we had a promotional on Monday nights. And so I went to work that night. I kissed the boys goodbye and walked out the house, and I went to the tavern. As I walked in the door, Don was there leaning over the counter, really intently talking on the phone. And I couldn't figure out what in the world could be that important. It's so busy. What are you doing, talking on the phone? And he hung up the phone, and his face was just ashen color. And he came towards me and grabbed my arm and was pulling me out the door, saying words that were just unbelievable, that my son Mark had been hit by a car. And we drove to the hospital and got there just as the ambulance was coming in. And I saw them pull his little body out of the ambulance like he was asleep. And a doctor came running out asking me, "How did this happen? How did this happen?" And I don't know how it happened. And they took him into the hospital right away. And Don and I were led into a room where we waited and waited and waited, one excruciating hour after another. And pretty soon a nurse came out and asked me to said that I should call a priest. And I said, "No, I don't want a priest there. I want you to fix my son. I don't want a priest interfering. What could he do?" And pretty soon the priest came anyway, and I grabbed his arm. I said, "No, don't go in there. I don't want you interrupting the doctors. You might cause something bad to happen." But he went in anyway, and they shut the door. And I was angry that they had shut me out and weren't listening to me. And so continued to wait throughout the night. And as morning approached, Dawn and I walked down the hallway, and I was looking out a window and watching lights coming on in the houses down below and cars going by, and new people were starting a new day. And I thought to myself, how could that possibly be? And don't they know what's going on here in this hospital? And I heard footsteps coming down the hall, and I knew what was going to happen. I knew what they were going to say, but I just refused to hear it. But the doctor's voice came through loud and clear that they had done all they could, but they were not able to save Mark. And we worked into Marky's room, and he was so cold, and I pulled the covers up over him and leaned down to kiss him and saw a tear in his eye. And I went, Marky, don't cry. Mommy's here. It's like Mommy can fix everything. Everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. And at that point, I just collapsed. I just collapsed alongside the bed. And I don't remember much after that. I know we left the hospital and we're driving around in the car, and I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to face his clothes and his toys and his things. And I just, it was just horrible. Finally, I knew we had to go home. We had to tell Chris, his brother, what had happened. Chris was with Mark when Mark was hit by the car, and Mark had a playful spirit, and he was kind of jumping towards cars as they were going by. They were forbidden to go up by the busy street, but the babysitter had allowed that, and I guess not paying attention to the boys, and so as Marky was kind of playfully jumping towards the cars that were speeding by, it was a 4-lane street. The one car stopped to let him go, and he ran into the street, and then the car on the opposite lane came speeding by and hit him. And Chris went running out to him, and Marky, are you okay? And Mark's eyes were open, but he was still. So Chris just turned around, and he had to go. People came to Mark, and they took him, and Chris had to walk home and tell the babysitter what had happened. And I can't even imagine the horrible trauma that seeing that happen. And as we got home, I told Chris, I said that, he came running to me and said, Mommy, did you hear what happened to Mark? And I told him, I said, Chris, yes, I know. And the doctors weren't able to save Mark, that he died. And Chris, of course, went screaming to his room, and he was really never the same after that. We had a lot of problems with him growing up, but none of us were the same after that, for sure. And myself, I had pretty much became a recluse. I wouldn't leave the house. I would sit and stare out the window hour after hour after hour, and I couldn't function. I just couldn't go on in life, and it just went on and on, and finally Don told me, Kat, you really do need to get out of the house. You need to try to move forward, and we started fighting a lot during that time. I again had no way to function, and just how could this horrible thing have happened to us? And I remember 2 ladies coming to the door and telling me that that Mark was better now that he was with Jesus. And I remember screaming at them, just taking a hold of this one lady and just shaking her and say, I'll tell you about your Jesus. Your Jesus kills little children. And I just slammed the door in their faces, just so angry that anybody could believe in a God that would kill little children, that let these horrible things in life happen. And so my anger and bitterness just grew and became a part of me, just eating up my very soul. And so when John suggested that I get out of the house more, I became more belligerent and more angry. And one night he insisted, he said, we had these friends that were having a gathering and we're going to go. And so as he halfway dragged me out of the house and to the car, I was arguing with him. I just can't do this. I don't want to do this. And why are you making me do this? And we got out of the car, and our bickering turned to arguing, and the arguing turned to yelling. And we were driving down a busy street, and I just, he says, Kat, you have to move on from this. And I just screamed at him, move on. And I came over at him so angry and just started beating at him, screaming, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. And I didn't really hate him, but the frustration, it was like a can of gasoline, and he dropped a match inside of me. I just lost it. I completely exploded. And so I was hitting him and just scratching at his face, and he's trying to pull the car over, and he took his arm and swung at me like that and hit me in the side of the back, and it knocked me clear over to my side of the car. And I kind of slumped down, and I said, just please take me home. And he did. He went into the house and was splashing cold water in his face, and I grabbed the car keys and thought, I will run just like I always did, just like I did that night at the tavern. I just ran, and I got in the car and I took off, and I felt pain inside of me, but I wasn't sure if I was just, my heart was breaking or if I really was something wrong with me. But as I drove the car, I realized I pulled over, and the pain got so severe that I couldn't even bend over, and I undid my clothes, and it was raining, pouring rain on me, and I was all wet, and I climbed in. I thought, I have to get home. And I don't know how I drove home, but I did. And as I drove up the driveway, Don was at the door and absolutely furious with me. And I tried to crawl past him, and he says, what are you doing? And I said, I'm trying to get to the phone. I need to call an ambulance. There's something really bad wrong with me. And he said, well, if you're that bad, I'll take you to the hospital. And he did. And we got to the hospital, and we were in a waiting room, and talking, and they didn't have MRIs or CAT scans or things of that sort at the time. And so all they could really go by was the fact they knew I had internal bleeding, because my blood count and my blood pressure, everything was dropping off the charts. And the doctors came in and they asked me how I got the bruise on my back. And I didn't want to tell them what had happened, because Don wasn't a wife beater. I didn't want them to think that. And if something happened to me, if I did die or something, what would happen to him? So I just said I didn't know. And they said, well, we need to take you into surgery and find out, because we suspect you have internal bleeding. And so they put me on a gurney, and we started down the hallway, and I heard Don's voice asking him to stop, and they did. And he leaned over and kissed me and told me that he loved me. And I was shocked, because I thought he didn't even like me anymore, let alone love me. And they then kept taking me into the surgery room, and we got in there, and they put the mask over my face, and I knew that I should be going to sleep, but I was wide awake, and it was dark. Everything just became dark. I couldn't see the surgeons anymore, the nurses. It just started getting really dark, but I was wide awake, and I realized I can't breathe. And I tried to bring my hands up, but they were strapped down for surgery, and I wanted to pull the mask off, and I was just this point of like, you're underwater, and you are gasping, you need air, and I can't breathe, and I was panicking, and all of a sudden I started moving through that darkness into what appeared to be like a cave or a tunnel of some sort. And I saw down below me, I knew I had died somehow. I'm not sure how, but was what I knew. And I saw down below me my husband, Don, and my son, and they were standing around what appeared to be a lamp post, and they were crying because I had died. And I wanted to tell them, no, I'm fine. I'm not sure what's happening, but I'm fine. I'm alive. But I knew at that point they were going to be just fine. And I don't know how to tell you how I knew that, but it was a strong knowing, not guessing or anything. I knew they would be just fine. They were going to be okay. And so I felt comfortable moving on from them. And then I passed four human figures standing off to my left that were in street clothes, normal people, weren't angels or anything, and they had these very concerned looks on their faces, like something terrible was about to happen to me. And it confused me, because I thought, what's wrong? And I didn't know who these people were. I mean, they could have been distant relatives or someone that I did know in my past, but nobody that I recognized. And then I slowly moved on from that. And then I heard this horrendous noise, like a freight train just barreling past me. And I felt this feeling, an intense feeling of a rope just burning through the middle of me. And the thought came to me, there is no God. And all of a sudden, all of this noise and this burning through the middle of me, and all of a sudden it stopped. And I knew that beyond any knowing that I've ever known in my lifetime, that God did exist, and God really existed, and I knew that. I mean, it's just like, I don't know, I put my hand up here, and that's my hand, and nobody's going to convince me that that's not my hand. That's impossible. It's my hand. So I knew with a knowing that's way beyond anything I can explain to you that God did exist. I mean, it was just the most exciting feeling that I'd ever had in my lifetime, because I had always searched for God, but never ever was able to find him. And in the end, had become so bitter and so angry that it didn't, it just didn't matter. But now I knew God existed. He existed. And I mean, it's been many, many years since that happened, and it's just as strong in my mind today as it was then. And then the sound came again, this freight train just barreling down on me, and this pulling through the chest of me, and then loud noise. And the thought came to me, there is no heaven. And all of a sudden that stopped. And I saw this brilliant light that I was being drawn towards. And I knew that that was heaven. And I knew that I was going there. And I knew that God existed. I'm going to heaven. The excitement that I felt inside of me was beyond anything that I would ever even try to tell you, because it's just a knowing that you know that you know, and it can't be explained. But this feeling of euphoria, of just the most incredible peace that I've ever felt, the excitement, the joy, that every positive word you can imagine flowing through you, just absolute energy and just incredible peace that just was beyond anything that anybody could ever explain. And I was being drawn towards this, and I knew that's where I was going. And I guess I knew I was leaving my husband and my children and everything behind, but this was it. This was where I was going. This was the most exciting, incredible thing that was going to happen. And I was almost there, and I heard the horrendous noise come again, and the pulling through my chest, and the thought, there is no hell. And it was as though the floor dropped out beneath you. I mean, you're sitting there now, and the floor opens up, and you fall into total darkness. And I knew that I was in hell. And I didn't believe in any of this prior to what happened to me. And I was falling into this darkness, total darkness that I have never ever even seen in my life before, much darker than night. And I was falling, and I felt the pain of burning, and I heard some screaming, and I was falling into this, and I knew I was in hell. And I knew that I had sent myself there. I knew that I had blasphemed God. I hated God. I screamed at those ladies, I hate God, I hate God. And God was fulfilling my desires to keep away from me, to turn from me. God didn't send me to hell, and I don't believe God sends anybody to hell. I knew that God didn't send me there. I knew that my blasphemy, my wish was to hate God, and God was fulfilling that wish. And I was following this, but I started screaming, God, I believe in you now. I mean, I had been just at the cusp of heaven. I was there with God, and I wanted that. I didn't want to be here. I don't want evil. I don't want any part of it. I never really did in my whole life. But I screamed out to God. I screamed out, and I thought, God doesn't hear me in here, does he? And nobody can save me. My husband loves me, but he can't save me. Nobody can throw a rope to me or come in here and help me. I mean, nobody even knows I exist. Probably God doesn't even know I exist. That's my thinking. But of course, God knows everything, and he didn't know that. And I was screaming to God, I believe in you now, God. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. I believe in you. I screamed that, screaming over and over again. But I knew this was for eternity, that I would fall in this place forever and ever. But all of a sudden it stopped. It just stopped. And things started going backwards. And I felt myself going back into the tunnel, and coming towards the entrance of the tunnel, I heard a voice say to me, bring people to me. And I believe that was the voice of God. And then I felt my spirit, which was actually separate from my physical body, which my physical body was in surgery at that point and had been declared clinically dead. I had been unhooked from life support, and the time had been taken that I was clinically dead. And so I felt my spiritual self, which was going through all this experience, enter back into my physical body. Along with that was a will to live. And will to live is an actual thing that when you die, that will to live goes away. You no longer want to live. And when your spirit separates from your body, that's you. That's who you are, and you will live on for eternity. That body will turn to dust. And so I felt my spiritual body enter back into my physical body. And then I woke up screaming, there is a God, there is a God. And I've been screaming that for over 50 years now. I mean, my feelings on that haven't dwindled one little bit. It's just as real to me today as it ever was. So, in leaving this, I think that I'm not anything special. People who have near-death experiences aren't anything special. Most of us are sent back with some kind of a mandate or a mission in life. And mine was to bring people to God. And for over 50 years, that's exactly what I have been doing. And my faith in God has grown stronger and stronger. My husband is a big believer. What he saw, the change in me, what happened, who I was prior to this experience and who I was afterwards, the calm and the peace that came about me, and my ability to be happy and to live and to accept the things in life that had happened to me, the abuses and my son dying and the molestation and all the horrible things that I had gone through, all became peace to me, because in the end, I know where I'm going and what's going to happen to me and my family. And my sons are serving the Lord right now too. My one son that witnessed Mark dying, really got into rebellion, became a biker, and rode with some very bad biker gangs, or biker clubs, I guess they're called. And but he turned his life to the Lord, and now is in ministry to street people, and riding with Christian bike clubs, and doing wonderful things. And so life has turned great for us. I mean, God helped me to redeem our lives financially, physically, every way possible. And so I'm here to tell you, God is real. I believe, like I say, that we were sent back for a mission, but what I want you to know is that during the dying process, we don't know what happens to people. So you might have a loved one or someone that has died, and you thought, boy, if anyone was destined to hell, that person was. But you don't know that during the dying process that they were given that same revelation that I was, that God became real to them, and they were able then to accept the Lord. And so I want you to be encouraged by that, because even yourself, if you have the doubts and all, I would ask you to keep searching. But I think that everyone has that opportunity during the dying process to do what's right or to do what's wrong. It's your choice, and I guess, like I say, some will choose wrong, but hopefully not. So anyway, thank you for letting me share my story. I hope it's brought encouragement to some. And if you have any questions or doubts about things, I'd love to hear from you. I recently wrote my story in a memoir that it's called "Is It Safe to Die?" And anyway, I think that for most people it is. So God bless all of you, and thank you for this time.